Welcome, ladies and gents. Chris Andre here. Let's talk boxing. One last dive into the whole saga surrounding Alexander Usyk and Daniel Dubois, because there's a new narrative that's doing the rounds online, and that is that Alexander Usyk is glass-bodied. People are saying, I've heard of a glass chin before. I've never heard of a glass body until I saw Alexander Usyk. We're going to talk about whether that narrative has any validity to it and how it's come about. I also want to talk about a particular quote from Don Charles. He's been quoted by Boxing News as saying that Alexander Usyk couldn't live with the heavyweights of the past like Lennox Lewis, the Klitschko brothers, and that Fury will play with him. I'm going to reserve a prediction for Fury and Usyk for the fight being made. I still remain positive that it will be. And I'll do my own technical breakdown and get very detailed with footage, and I'll give you my prediction for then. What I will say is this: the reason I'm so desperate to see that fight is because, in my humble opinion, you're talking about two all-time greats, and it would be a fight for the ages. I don't think anyone in history plays with Alexander Usyk in the same way that nobody in history plays with Tyson Fury. I know a lot of people will say, Chris, how can you rate them both so highly when Alexander Usyk's CV at heavyweight is thin? And many of you also feel that Tyson Fury's CV at heavyweight is also nowhere near as beefed up as some of the other great heavyweights of the past. Look, I do my technical breakdown videos. I employ my own eyeball test. I understand that it's subjective. I can only talk to you about what it is that I see in the ring. And I feel that I'm watching two special fighters when I'm seeing these two operate. Now, when it comes to Alexander Usyk, because I'm a believer that styles make fights, if you were to say to me, Chris, I'll give you £1 million if you can pick any three heavyweights in history, we'll clone them, any one of them has to beat him. You've got three choices, his next three fights. Whoever I pick of those three, I'm not giving any of them above a 60% chance. In other words, the least amount that I would give Usyk against anyone is 40%, and that's because of styles rather than levels. There are some fighters who are great that I'd give him a 90% chance against because he'd be all wrong for them. And like I said, I feel the same way about Tyson Fury. They're two great fighters. But I understand why Don Charles feels the way he feels, because at the end of the day, he has worked so hard to get to this point. He'd had two failed attempts as a trainer to win a world title in the past. He'd worked on that shot in training, and you saw them working on it in the pads. He landed it. And for those that feel that it was low, and I'm one of them, it was low by what? We're talking about a matter of inches here. If that lands a little bit higher and still has the same effect, he's the trainer of the new unified heavyweight champion of the world. So you can understand why he feels as though the A side got the benefit of the doubt and that Alexander Usyk milked that situation. He's bound to be upset, Don Charles. So don't hold it against him, but I personally do disagree with his take. Now, why are people referring to Alexander Usyk as having a glass body? Well, this video is doing the rounds, and it shows that leaping left hook from Levitt going back to 2011. It also shows a right hook from Beterbiev as Usyk's trying to pivot out and stretching those abs to the max. And it reminds me a little bit of people going back to the Sean Porter loss too. Usyk was 19 years old at that point. He'd only started boxing when he was 15, and he had yet to grow into a man's body. He was basically a teenager at the time. And people still go back 18 years to try and find that weakness in him, right? You have to understand, yes, these are all shots that are to the body, often low in the body, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I've spoken myself about having to target the body with Usyk because there are openings there. He has often a triangle guard, and there are openings at the base of that. I spoke about it way before this saga of this fight or the last fight. We were talking about this in the build-up to the first Anthony Joshua fight. Maris Briedis had opportunities there. And we spoke about how you go about working those openings. But to target something because it's a potential opening doesn't mean that somebody's very weak there or that it's a glass body. First and foremost, this is a guy that's fought almost 400 bouts, amateur and pro. And if that's that short little list you're coming up with of him getting buzzed or hurt to the body, well, then you're really stretching if you're going to start referring to him as having a glass body. In terms of those actual shots that we've shown, we've already discussed the Daniel Dubois low blow, and we're going to get back into that in this video too, because somebody's challenged me. In fact, 3 of you have challenged me on my particular video on something that I said, and you've shown me some footage of something else. So I'm going to address that. But you can see here, Medvedov is landing a Golovkin type shot right down onto that pecker. Right? That's not even the balls. That's right on the Johnson. Right? That is a clear low blow. Anthony Joshua, you can see his wrist sort of bends upwards as it lands. So the glove, his wrist has bent backwards as he's landed this punch. And he's lucky he didn't hurt his own wrist with this punch. But look at where the trajectory of the forearm's pointing towards. His wrist may have bent here, but it's a low blow. So how vulnerable is Usyk really to the body? If he had a glass body, he would have been stopped. He's been in there against monster punchers, the likes of Murat Gassiev, Anthony Joshua, Daniel Dubois, big thudding guys too, like Joe Joyce in the amateurs and Derek Chisora as a pro. These guys are heavy-handed big men. Many of them sought to target the body. None of them got Alexander Usyk out of there. How much of a glass body can he possibly have? If your only test of that claim is that, yeah, okay, he's been hurt on numerous occasions, does that mean that these other guys, these great fighters of the past who have been hurt multiple times to the face and to the body, are somehow also glass-chinned or glass-bodied? Think of the likes of Muhammad Ali, Carl Froch, Joe Joyce. These are guys that are either iron-chinned or have incredible rates of recovery. They've all been hurt badly. They've all been dropped badly. In the case of Joe Joyce, he was stopped in the amateurs too against Sergei Kuzmin when Sergei Kuzmin was a bit of a menace. He was also stopped as a pro against Zhilei Zhang most recently, and he was rocked and buzzed on numerous occasions. Muhammad Ali, on multiple occasions apart from those fights where he was dropped, was hurt. Does this mean that somebody who has great rates of recovery is glass-chinned because he was hurt to the chin on multiple occasions? And that means that Usyk as well, because he's been hurt to the body on a few occasions, is glass-bodied? Come on, guys. Now, moving on from that, let's also talk about Jack Reiss, who is a top-class, internationally renowned referee. He was the referee that took charge of Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, the first fight. He appeared on the DAZN boxing show, and he sought to clarify the rules regarding a low blow. And what's happened here is that Jack Reiss has actually reinforced some of the things I've been saying with regards to the rules. But when he then talks about the implementation of the rules, he actually contradicts himself. So a lot of people have brought this to my attention to use it as evidence against my position that Daniel Dubois landed low. But listen to what Jack Reiss actually has to say.
It's very simple. You guys put your hands on your hips right now. Right. You're feeling the top of two bony structures, right? Yeah. If you took your hands and you took these two fingers and you slid them across till the two fingers meet, that line you just drew is the hip line. And everyone's belly button is different. There's people with belly buttons a lot higher and stuff. Right.
Well, I can't use the belly button. So what a low blow is, anytime a majority of the glove is below that hip line.
So on the hip line is legal, and it doesn't start getting illegal until the majority of the glove starts getting below it. So here's that hip line. I just wanted to show you a picture and just say something about the punch. It was dynamic, it was moving, and it was close enough to being on the line where it's a referee's discretion. And if he's calling it a fair blow, it's going to stand in line. If the punch lands like this, it's right in the middle, above, it's better. If it starts to get like this, it's still a legal blow. But a referee should start questioning the guy about bringing his punches on.
So let's break down some of the things that Jack Reiss spoke about there. When it comes to the rules, because that's a different thing to the implementation of the rules. But when it comes to the rules, he clarifies a few things, and this reinforces the position that I've taken all along. If you put your hands on your hips, you put your fingers across, it comes across there as a line. That is what constitutes what is allowed and what is not allowed. It has nothing to do with the belly button or the actual waistline on the trunks itself. And he speaks about them being of a different thickness, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I also put a photograph, as he put up here, prior to this video even going up, where I was showing the difference between the navel and the top of the hip bone, and I was explaining that there is a couple of inches difference in that regard. Now, this adds weight to those that are arguing in favor of Daniel Dubois, because that means there's more room for error. It was still low, though, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I'm just trying to show you that I'm being totally fair here. You have to be accurate. You can't just say, oh, it was below the navel, it must have been low, just because it suits you to say that. That's not what the rules are. Now, one of the other things that Jack Reiss points to is that the thickness of the belt line of the trunks themselves these days is thicker than it used to be. They're 4 or 5 inches now, he says. So what we use as a measuring stick is not the navel or the belt line thickness, it's the actual hip bone. And some people on Twitter have jumped up and said, well, there you go. You see, if it was in the days of the Foreman and Ali's of the world, then that punch would have been okay. Well, no, what it would have done, because as you can see here from George Foreman's belt, it being so thin, you would have had even more of the glove below the belt line. So what you would have seen is that it's even more obvious that less of the punch landed on the belt line, because the belt line's thinner, because the majority of the glove was below the belt line. Now, that takes us on to the contradiction of Jack Reiss. So whilst he's correct 100% obviously on what the rules are, when he's talking about how he interpreted the punch, he contradicts himself. He says in one point that It's only an illegal blow if the majority of the glove is below the waistline. But then later on, he goes on to say that if you land with this sort of area here, as you can see on your picture on screen, the majority of the glove is below. He says it's still legal because it's on the belt line, and you would ask the fighter to keep his gloves up. Well, which of the two is it, Jack? A minute ago you said if the majority of the glove is below the belt line, then it's an illegal blow. And then you're saying if the majority of the glove's below the belt line, you'd let it go, but you'd warn him to keep his gloves up. Why are you going to warn him of anything if what he's doing is not wrong, if it's not illegal? So when you actually analyze what Jack Reiss is saying here, he too is accepting that something is not quite right with that shot. But in addition to that, he also explains that it's down to the referee's discretion. So whichever way you look at it, the referee, if it's down to his discretion and he felt that it was low, then people can't complain. If what Jack Reiss initially said is correct, then it is correct, that the hip bone is the line, but that the majority of the glove cannot be below the belt line, otherwise it's an illegal blow, then once again, it proves that the shot was low. So let's just look into this for a second a bit further. When you're talking about what constitutes the hip bone, look at this photo here of Alexander Usyk where he's bending forward. His back is straight, it's not arched, so he's not curled around in some sort of yoga type pose. It's a straight back. If he was to bend down to touch his toes, he would bend in the same way with that straight back. That's the pivot point, the lock, so to speak, of the back. In other words, the bum, the top of the bum, which starts there's the bottom of the bum there, the curves here, which tells us that on the bottom of the weight strap, where that bend begins, as you can see from both sides, that's roughly where the hip bone is. You bend at the hip. It's a phrase. So the hip bone, if you were to look from the left thigh and follow it up to the curvature, is roughly here, the bottom of the waist strap. So even if the waistband is thick, because the lower part seems to be directly in line with where he's naturally bending, you can use that as a measuring stick as to where the hip bone begins. Now, I'm not going to mention this other person's channel because I'm not here to start any sort of beefs or anything stupid like that. You know, I respect everyone who's out there trying to do their best to put out some really good content. And a lot of people are genuine. They're not all trying to contribute to some sort of narrative, right? So I'm not going to mention this person's channel, but I'm bringing it up because it was sent to me to challenge my own video and say, how do you explain this then? So I'm just going to talk about some of the points that are made here. On this particular video, this person suggests that the belly button of Alexander Usyk is right in the middle of, I'll call it a P because in English it's a P, and Cyrillic is actually an R. But in the middle of that P, you can see where that green line's come across. He assumes that the navel is in line with that. And he's drawn a green line across to show that it's actually in line with the bottom of the D, the letter on the back of Alexander Usyk's shorts. Now, the truth is, because he's bent forward, there's no way that the top of the shorts at the front are in line with the bottom of the shorts at the back, right? He's just bent forward here. But for argument's sake, let's say this is accurate. We'll concede that just to show you that it doesn't make a difference. So the bottom of the D at the back here, the lettering, is where the navel would be in line with Alexander Usyk, for example. Well, if you take the two frames, in this first frame, the gentleman refutes that this punch has actually landed, and he points to the shadow in front of the glove as being evidence of this. We'll get to that in a moment. But I've drew a little brown line across here, as you can see. What he claims is that when the punch lands, you can see the ruffling of the shorts more obviously, and that this lifted Alexander Usyk's shorts up. But this is using his own graph, his own frame. You can see he's used graphs in the background here, his own frame. This YouTube video link here is actually two separate photos. I've taken two separate photos. They split across this line here. But the line seems perfect, the timer of the YouTube line, because I've literally put them side by side. No dodgy business going on. I haven't lowered one photo or anything like that. This is literally a millisecond apart from here to here. And you can see the bottom of the D on the back of the shorts has gone up very marginally. We're talking what, a centimetre or two? It makes no real difference. Now, in terms of the idea of a shadow in front of the glove, a shadow is merely a blockage in the trajectory of light. You can quite clearly see with these body shots that the fighters are having their actual skins ruffled. These punches have landed. Look at just in front of the gloves, you can see the shadows. So this idea that a shadow means that a shot has yet to land is also untrue. Let's go back to that photo where I'm showing you the bend of the hip and where the actual hip bone is. Now from there, I've added a yellow line to the initial photo I showed you before, one frame after the other with the brown line above. That is the bottom of the short. So that is where the hip line is. So if you draw a line across from the bottom of the waistband, the top of where the hip bone would be, right across there, you can see that the majority of the glove is below that yellow line. What Jack Reiss initially said would be an illegal blow until he contradicted himself and then said he would allow it. It's down to the discretion of the referee, but he would ask the fighter to keep his glove up. Even if he's going to allow it, he recognizes that it's up to the discretion of the referee, and he still would have asked Dubois to keep his gloves up. So whichever way you cut it, guys, it was a low shot. Regardless of whether you stand on that with me or not, whether you agree or disagree, the idea that Alexander Usyk somehow has a glass body, because people have found a handful of examples where he's either been hurt or dropped with body shots, when the dude has never been stopped as a pro, despite being in as well with monster punches in amateur and pro. If you have a glass jaw or body or anything else, you ain't surviving against these guys. Trust me. This is an elite level fighter, regardless of whether you think it should have gone to Dubois, regardless of whether you think Tyson Fury destroys him. He's elite. Let me know what you think, ladies and gents. Please don't forget to hit a stiff jab on the like button, a right cross on the subscribe button, and an uppercut on the notifications button. Thanks for watching. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.